Some stories are never told, not because they're forgotten, but because people are afraid. Afraid of the truth. Afraid of what the light might reveal when it touches the shadows they've learned to live with. In June of 1980, in a quiet village tucked behind cornfields and the low rise of forgotten hills, 4 nuns disappeared without a trace. No goodbyes, no screams, no blood, no bodies. Only the church bell kept ringing each morning as if nothing had ever happened. They called it the convent mystery, and then they stopped talking. Or maybe they just pretended to forget. 28 years later, I was assigned to that same parish. I was new. I had no connection to the past. I had never even heard the names of the missing sisters, and I had no idea that I was about to step straight into the heart of a secret this village had buried for nearly 30 decades. It started with a tree. Or more accurately, what lay beneath it. A root had split open after a storm. A logger noticed the earth beneath it was disturbed, and what he found should never have been there. If this story sends chills down your spine and you want to uncover more dark secrets behind seemingly perfect crimes, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every click brings us one step closer to the truth. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now turn off the lights, maybe switch on a quiet fan, and let's begin tonight. The morning I arrived in Hollow Creek, the fog hadn't lifted. The village looked like it hadn't woken up in years. I drove slowly through the narrow streets, gravel whispering under the tires. My windshield wipers squeaked once every 30 seconds, though the drizzle had already stopped. The church stood at the edge of town like it had been waiting for someone. Small, stone, and worn down by decades of wind and silence. I parked near the bell tower. No one came out to greet me. No curious eyes peeking from windows. Just the muffled call of a distant crow and the thick scent of damp earth. Inside the rectory, everything had been cleaned, but not touched. The furniture was dated, polished, but too still. There were no photos, no notes from the previous priest, just a name on the door that had been scratched out. I spent the first hour unpacking, moving my books onto the shelves, placing my rosary beside the bed. And then I sat. The silence was too much. I told myself I was just tired from the move, from the long drive, but something in the stillness pressed against my chest like a weight. When I walked over to the church to pray, I noticed the door creaked like it hadn't opened in days. Inside, it smelled like ash and thyme. Old candles melted into pews. A single Bible lay open on the altar, yellowed and curling. I knelt, but the words wouldn't come. Something about that space made me feel like I wasn't alone. Behind the altar, I found a narrow door I hadn't seen before. It led down a stone staircase, cold, damp, unused. I didn't go down, not yet, but I noted it, marked it in my mind. Later that afternoon, the wind picked up. I stood outside, watching the trees bend like they were bowing to something older than them. That's when I saw the logger's truck, parked awkwardly on the slope near the back of the cemetery, half hidden by fog. A man in a red coat was staring down at the ground, motionless. I walked over. He didn't turn until I was close. "Tree came up," he said. His voice was flat, like he was trying not to feel something. "Storm last night. Roots tore through the old soil." I looked down. The earth was cracked open where a massive oak had fallen. Roots jutted into the air like snapped bones. And there, tucked beneath them, something cloth-like, faded, soiled. "What is that?" I asked. He didn't answer. I crouched, my fingers hesitated. A piece of black fabric, tattered, mold-stained, but stitched at the edge. A thin blue cross, faded,
almost gone. I knew that symbol. I'd seen it once, long ago, in an old parish history book. The emblem sewn onto the habits worn by the Sisters of Hollow Creek. I stood up, but the logger was already walking away.
I didn't sleep that night. Not because of the storm, that had passed by sunset, but because of that scrap of fabric and what it meant. The sisters, 4 of them, names long forgotten by the town, their photographs taken down from the parish walls some time before my arrival. They'd been assigned here in the summer of 1980, right after the last priest retired. And then, 2 months later, they vanished, all 4. No signs, no explanations, just gone. No bodies were ever found, no notes, no calls. The official story was that they left in the middle of the night, disillusioned, burned out, overwhelmed. But I'd read enough of the diocesan reports to know better. The last line in the file from 1981 read simply, "Case closed, chapel reassigned to maintenance custody." But the cloth under the roots, it was their habit. It was from here, and it had been buried under that tree for decades. In the morning, I returned to the spot. The logger's truck was gone, and no one from the village had come to inspect the scene. I brought gloves, a trowel, a small wooden cross from my travel case. I told myself I would dig only a little, just enough to see what lay beneath. The soil was soft from the rain. Each scoop exposed more of the black cloth. Then, bone. At first, just a fragment, a curve of something white, old. Then, more. A full rib cage, folded in on itself like someone had died curled tight. A rosary draped through the rib bones, beads fused together by time and decay. I dropped the trowel. My heart was pounding, but the air stayed silent. No birds, no wind. I whispered a prayer, though the words barely came out. By noon, I had called the county, told them I'd found remains on church grounds. I didn't mention the cloth, not yet. They said someone would be out in 2 days. 2 days. I walked back to the rectory and stood at the window, looking out across the cemetery. There were more oaks like that one, tall, rooted deep, older than the church itself. Any one of them could be hiding more. That night, the door behind the altar creaked open by itself. I hadn't touched it. I was sure I'd left it closed. It opened slowly, like someone was waiting just on the other side of it. I stood frozen in the center aisle, the altar candles still unlit, the cold stone pressing through my socks. A sound came from below. One soft step. Then silence. And then another step. Someone, or something, was in the dark beneath the church. But when I shouted down, when I demanded to know who was there, nothing answered. Only a low wind began to howl outside, rustling the trees again, just like it had the day before.
By morning, I convinced myself it had been the storm. Old churches creak in the wind, foundations settle, and wooden doors always seem to swell and shift with moisture. That was all it had been, I told myself. Just air and old stone and my imagination working overtime after finding something that should never have been buried. But when I opened the door to the cellar beneath the altar, the air hit me like a closed tomb. It was cold, wet, smelled of mold and oil and something else, like rust, old blood. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, but I went down anyway, flashlight in one hand, the other trailing the wall. The light flickered as I reached the bottom, the beam catching dust motes thick as snowflakes. The basement had always been there. I'd stored old choir robes down there, decorations for Christmas, crates of hymnals that no one ever touched anymore. But now, it felt different, wrong. In the back corner was the locked storage cupboard I'd never opened. The key had long been lost, and I'd never had cause to worry about it. But now, the door was ajar. The padlock still hung from the latch, but the wood beneath it had been forced, cracked just enough for someone to squeeze their fingers in and pry it open. I stepped forward and pulled it wide. Inside was a bundle wrapped in linen. Not clean, not white, but old and yellowed, crusted around the edges like it had been soaked and dried again and again. I crouched down, and that's when I saw the second rosary. It was identical to the one I'd found under the tree. Beads made of carved bone. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Not yet. I backed out, slowly, and closed the door to the cellar behind me. This was no longer just about a missing person or a forgotten tragedy. This was a place that had held secrets for decades. The next day, I drove into town to speak with the only man still alive who'd been at the church back in 1980, Mr. Alvin Charles, the groundskeeper then, long retired, half blind now, and living above the pharmacy. He didn't answer when I knocked, but I waited. And when the door creaked open, he stared at me with a look that chilled my spine. "You opened it, didn't you?" he said. I didn't answer. "You weren't supposed to go down there," he whispered. "They told us to seal it, to never speak of it again." "Who told you?" I asked. He shook his head. "You think it was just the nuns who vanished?" I waited. He just closed the door. Later that night, I checked the cupboard again. The linen bundle was gone. No signs of entry. The cellar locked tight. But something had taken it back. And as I sat in my room, the wind returned. Not like a storm, but a whisper, pressing against the windows, sliding beneath the doors. And from somewhere outside the chapel, I heard singing, low and slow, the cadence of old prayers in a language I didn't recognize. I stayed up until dawn. I didn't tell anyone about the singing. Not at first. What would I say anyway? That I'd heard ghostly voices outside a chapel built a century ago? That a rosary made of bone had vanished from a locked basement? The townsfolk already thought the church was cursed. I didn't want to give them more reason to keep away. But by the time Friday came, I wasn't sleeping. I was keeping vigil. That night, I sat in the pew closest to the altar, all the lights off, a single candle burning beside me. The air hung heavy, still damp from the rain 3 days earlier. I kept my Bible open in my lap, not reading, just holding. The silence stretched until it didn't feel like silence anymore, more like waiting, like something was listening. Then, just after 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Voices, barely audible, just outside the stained glass windows. But this time, the words were clearer. Latin, maybe, chanting, a slow, mournful rhythm, like a funeral rite. Not angry, not demonic, just sorrowful, broken. I moved quietly, stepping into the hallway that led to the side door. I opened it as gently as I could, candle in hand, and stepped into the fog. The night was thick, moonless. Every sound was magnified, my own breathing, the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes, and still the chanting continued. I followed it around the chapel's eastern wall, toward the garden no one tended anymore. Vines curled up the fence posts, ivy choked the old statues of saints whose names had worn away. And then I saw them. Not clearly, not faces, not skin, just the impression of 4 figures kneeling in the dirt beside the birdbath, shrouded in something dark, still, utterly still. I blinked, and they were gone. The chanting stopped. My heart was racing. I stumbled forward, trying to see where they'd gone, whether they'd left footprints or any sign at all. But there was nothing. Only the birdbath, and beside it, a small wooden token carved with a cross. I bent to pick it up, but before I could, a sound behind me made me freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I turned, candle held high, and saw no one. But something had changed. The chapel door was wide open. I hadn't left it that way. I ran inside,
breath catching in my throat. My pulse thundered. Every instinct screamed for me to get out, to leave, to call someone. But who would I call? Instead, I locked the doors behind me and sat in the front pew, holding the wooden token. It was hand-carved, worn smooth along the edges like it had been held for years. It smelled of oil and something else, something faintly metallic. That's when I noticed the initials on the underside, M.R. I knew that name. Sister Marianne Rousseau, one of the 4 who vanished in 1980. No body had ever been found, no grave, just her name on a plaque in the chapel wall. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even move. By sunrise, I made a decision. I was going to reopen the church archives, the dusty filing cabinets buried beneath decades of neglect in the vestry. I needed answers. I needed to know what happened that summer, what the church chose to forget, what they'd buried, and why something, or someone, wanted it remembered. I unlocked the archive door with trembling hands just after 7 the next morning. No one had entered that part of the vestry in years, not since Father Donnelly's time, and even then, barely. The key was stiff, the hinges groaned, and the dust lay thick over everything like a layer of untouched snow. The smell hit me first: mildew, old paper, candle wax. It smelled like secrets. Inside were 4 rusted filing cabinets, an oak desk missing a leg, and a dozen or so sealed boxes stacked haphazardly in the corner, labeled with faded masking tape. 1975, 1976, 1977, 1978, and then 1979. No 1980. Not a single box or folder marked with the year of their disappearance. That made my stomach twist. I went back to 1979 and started digging. What I found were mostly dull records, ledgers of donations, schedules for choir practice, letters from parishioners about missing hymnals and heating issues. But there was one folder near the bottom that caught my eye. It wasn't labeled, just a thick envelope sealed with brittle red wax and tucked inside the back of a larger file on building repairs. It was addressed to Father Donnelly. The handwriting was small, slanted, deliberate. I opened it. Inside was a single-page letter, unsigned, and a photograph, black and white, heavily creased. The letter read, "Forgive me, Father, for what I've hidden. The sisters had doubts. They asked too many questions. We were warned, but they kept pushing. When the voices started, we should have listened. The ground remembers, so do the trees. I beg you, destroy this. Burn the roots before they find the door." Burn the roots. The words echoed like thunder in my chest. The photograph was worse. It showed 4 women, all in habits, seated at the edge of a clearing. Their faces were turned slightly from the camera. Behind them stood something large, shadowy, blurred by motion or light exposure. I couldn't make it out, but it was tall, towering, and watching them. A sick heat rose in me. I turned the photo over. On the back, again in the same small handwriting, taken June 1980, last day they were seen. I didn't know what to do with it. What do you do with proof that the church buried something? I copied the letter and the photo with my phone, tucked the originals back into the folder, and returned everything as I'd found it. I didn't want anyone knowing what I had. Not yet. By noon, I was back at my desk. I stared at the picture over and over. I tried enhancing it, zooming in, but whatever loomed behind them stayed just out of clarity. That's when I realized it. The background of the photo, the tree line, it looked familiar. Not from memory, from recent life. from where the logger had been working just last week, near the western boundary of the parish grounds, past the old orchard, near the foot of the ridge. That was the area we called Deadwood, and nobody, not even the local kids, ever went there. Too steep, too overgrown, too many snakes, people said. But now I had a reason to. That afternoon, I packed a bag, water, flashlight, phone, a small cross I'd kept since seminary. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something inside me, some trembling instinct, knew I wouldn't be coming back the same. At 3:30, I left the church. By 4, I was at the base of the ridge, staring up into the tangled brush and dark canopy. The woods were whispering. And I walked in anyway. The first 20 minutes were easy enough. The path wasn't marked, but it was there. An old hunting trail, maybe, or just the worn footsteps of deer and desperate men. The air grew cooler the farther I went, the trees pressing in close, their leaves filtering the sun until everything was green shadow and damp silence. I kept thinking about the photograph, about the phrase in the letter, "Burn the roots." I didn't know if it was metaphor or instruction. I didn't care. I just wanted answers. Eventually, the trail vanished, swallowed by undergrowth and moss, and I found myself pushing through branches, stepping over roots like twisted veins in the earth. My cassock caught on brambles. My hand bled where a thorn dragged across it. The woods changed, grew quiet in a way I hadn't felt before. There were no birds, no wind, just that muffled, wet kind of silence you find deep in forests where things grow too old to die. And then I saw it, the stump. It was massive, half-rotten, a jagged black ring with a hollow center wide enough to crouch in. The tree must have been 100 years old, maybe more. And there, embedded in the heartwood like a knot in the flesh, was something pale, something wrong. I stepped closer. It was bone. Not old animal bone, not the bleached, broken remains of something long dead. This was deliberate. This was human. And it was placed, arranged. I knelt, looked harder. 4 small bones, shaped in a cross, tied with what I first thought was leather cord, but it wasn't. It was hair. Bound in human hair, still dark, still matted. I staggered back, my chest squeezed like something had taken hold of my lungs. I had read things, hushed things. In seminary, late at night, books that weren't meant for open study. Warnings about local rites, pagan remnants that survived in corners of the world no one visited anymore. Things about blood and trees and silence. This felt like that. Not demonic, not theatrical. Older than that. Rural, hungry. I wanted to run. But I saw something else, behind the stump, half covered in earth and vines. A stone slab. Small, barely noticeable. Like a footstone, not a headstone. Just a name, carved in shaky lines. Sister Magdalene. And beneath it, another stone, barely visible. Sister Ruth. My mouth went dry. I dropped to my knees and brushed the dirt aside with trembling fingers. 2 more. Sister Miriam. Sister Claire. They were buried here. They were here all along. No church record, no headstones, no memorial. Just the woods, the bones, the silence. They hadn't vanished. They'd been silenced. I stood, dizzy. The air felt heavier now, like the trees leaned closer, listening, watching. I turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A voice. Low, fragile, singing. A hymn, faint, barely audible, the kind nuns used to hum while sweeping the nave. But there was no one behind me. Only trees. Still, the sound remained. Close, like breath at the back of my neck. I walked faster, then ran. Branches lashed my face, roots pulled at my feet. I didn't look back, not once. I broke through the trees just as dusk swallowed the horizon, falling to my knees in the weeds behind the parish fence. My heart pounded so loud I didn't hear the crickets. I didn't hear anything but that lingering song, echoing inside my skull like it had lived there for years. I don't know how long I sat there. By the time I returned to the rectory, the sky was black. My hands were shaking too much to hold a pen. I recorded everything into a voice memo on my phone. Every detail, every stone, every sound. Then I prayed, longer than I had in years. And I didn't sleep that night. I left the light on in every room.
At sunrise, I returned. I told myself it was about closure, about doing what was right, giving the sisters their names back at the very least. But the truth is, I was afraid. Not of the woods, not of the bones. I was afraid of doing nothing, of letting silence win again. I carried a shovel, a canvas satchel with bottled water, gloves, my old dictaphone, a rosary wrapped twice around my wrist. The forest didn't greet me kindly this time. It was colder than it should have been for June. The dew on the grass clung thick and heavy. Even the birds kept quiet, like they knew what I was going to find. It took longer to get back to the clearing, longer even though I'd marked the trail with bits of ribbon the night before. Some of them were gone, torn. One, tied to a branch, had been shredded down the middle like something clawed through it. The stump hadn't moved, but it looked darker, wetter, like it had been bleeding in the night. I didn't look into it again. I couldn't. I moved past it, to the stones. I started with Sister Magdalene. The dirt came up soft, too soft, like it had never fully settled. About a foot down, my shovel hit cloth. Then bone. Not a full skeleton, just fragments, deliberately broken, arranged, as if to keep her from rising. I didn't stop. I moved to Sister Ruth, then Miriam, then Claire. Each was the same. Each had a cross of hair and bone buried with them. Each grave was no deeper than a child's. But there were things in the dirt, objects hidden with them. A rosary with the beads carved from teeth. A page from scripture written in what looked like blood. A handkerchief stitched with runes I didn't recognize, symbols that weren't in any language I knew. I documented everything, photos, notes, voice memos. And that's when I heard it again. The hymn. Stronger now. And this time, it wasn't alone. It was joined by a second voice, then a third, then a fourth. Female, harmonized, soft as breath. I stood, turning in circles. The trees all looked the same. The sound came from every direction. No footsteps, no bodies, just singing. It wasn't in English, but I understood the feeling. It wasn't anger. It was grief. I packed everything, covered the graves as best I could, left the markers exposed. They deserved that, at least. I turned to leave, and there, at the base of the stump, was something new. A note. Crumpled, yellowed, weighted down with a stone. I picked it up. Scrawled in pencil, as if from a shaking hand. He was one of us, and he turned. He fed the earth with lies. We didn't scream, we prayed. Tell the church we sang. That was all. No name, no date. But I knew what it meant. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident of time or secrecy or even murder. This was ritual. This was chosen. Back at the rectory, I sat in silence for a long time before calling the bishop. I knew what I'd be told. Let it lie. Do not speak. The church protects its own. But I made the call anyway, left the message. And when no one returned it, I wasn't surprised, because I finally understood. They hadn't just vanished in 1980. They had been erased, buried in dirt and story, sealed in silence like they'd never existed. Until now. Until me.
I didn't sleep that night. The hymns followed me home. Not literally, at least not in sound, but in memory, in weight. Like they had been stitched into the lining of my coat, into the creases behind my eyes. I sat at my desk, the note laid out before me, smoothed flat with trembling hands. I stared at the words, trying to trace the loops of the handwriting, looking for something human in them, some hint of who had written it. "Tell the church we sang." That line wouldn't leave me alone. I typed it into search bars, scoured forums, old diocesan bulletins, archived newsletters. Nothing. No motto, no quote, no common phrase. It felt like a plea, or worse, an instruction. The next morning, the forest called again. Not metaphorically, not poetically. My phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. Area code from 3 towns over. A man's voice. Rough, breathy, careful, like he'd practiced what he was going to say and didn't want to get it wrong. "You're the priest that found them, aren't you?" I didn't answer at first. My throat went dry. He continued. "I was there in 1980. I was 15. My father, he was a groundskeeper for the retreat where the nuns disappeared." He paused, breathed in. "I saw them the night they vanished." I sat down hard in my chair. "I can't talk long," he said, "but there's something you need to see, something that didn't make it into the reports." I scribbled down what he told me. Coordinates. An old maintenance shed near the rear path of the woods, long abandoned, supposedly collapsed. "It's still standing," he said, "barely. Go at first light, and don't go alone." But I went alone. Of course I did. I arrived before dawn, the trees swallowing what little light the moon had left behind. The shed wasn't collapsed. It was intact. Vines climbed its sides like veins. Moss covered the door. The wood was blackened with age, but hadn't rotted. I pried it open. The hinges screamed. Inside, dust, damp air, collapsed shelves, broken jars, and a smell. Old, sharp. Not death exactly, but something left to die a long time ago and never properly mourned. I stepped inside, sweeping my flashlight across the floor. There, under a tarp, I found what he must have meant. A trunk. Steel, rusted at the corners. Padlock broken. I knelt and opened it. Inside, carefully wrapped in burlap, were 3 habits. Torn, blood-stained, folded like sacred relics. And beneath them, a diary. Water-damaged, the leather cover warped, but the ink inside, still legible. The name on the first page, Sister Miriam. My breath hitched. I turned the pages. Most of the entries were scripture passages, copied by hand. Reflections on daily life, on prayer, on silence. But then the tone shifted. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before the sisters vanished, read, "There are whispers beneath the floorboards, in the chapel, at night. I feel them more than I hear them. The others feel it too. We no longer pray alone. Something watches." Another, "Father Michael tells us to ignore it, that fear is a test. But I saw him last night speaking to the walls. The candles were already out." And finally, "I believe we are being offered, not protected. I believe the prayers are not reaching God, but something else. If we are not here tomorrow, let this be known. We did not consent." I didn't move for a long time. The flashlight dimmed. My hands trembled too hard to hold it steady. When I emerged from the shed, daylight had returned. I stood in that clearing and looked at the trees, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 20 years as a priest. Terror. Not fear of death, but fear of being believed.
I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove to the old church, St. Luke's, the very same where the four sisters had once served. It had been shuttered for nearly a decade, the roof in partial collapse, the stained glass shattered by storms and time. But the foundation still stood. The bell tower still reached for the sky like a pleading hand. I parked behind the church, out of view from the road, and took the diary with me. The sanctuary smelled of mildew and crumbled memory. Pews broken and overturned, an altar stripped bare. The cross, iron wrought and rusting, still hung at the far end of the nave. And yet, somehow, I felt like I was being watched. I sat where the sisters might have sat. I opened the diary again. Not to the cryptic entries about floorboard whispers or candlelit murmurs, but to the back. I hadn't read that far yet. There, past the final prayer, something else had been added. Different ink, rougher penmanship. One sentence scrawled diagonally across 2 pages. "We are buried but not gone. He made sure of that." No name, no signature. Just that. I leaned back, hands shaking again. He. The diary had mentioned Father Michael before. He was their priest, their spiritual leader, their protector. But the more I sat with the words, the more I heard accusation in them. I remembered what the man on the phone said, the one who claimed to be the son of the retreat's groundskeeper. I pulled out the number I'd saved. Called it. Disconnected. I tried again, and again. Nothing. He had warned me, told me not to go alone. And yet I had, because I didn't believe I'd find anything. But I did. I left the church and drove straight to the archives, an old room in the basement of the diocesan office. There was no one on duty, just a volunteer receptionist who let me sign in without question. I requested files from 1979 and 1980, specifically anything on St. Luke's, the retreat grounds, and Father Michael Hastings. The name raised no alarm. The box arrived 30 minutes later, dusty, unopened for decades. Inside, newsletters, financial reports, rosters of visiting clergy, and then a personnel file. Father Michael Hastings. Ordained in 1963, assigned to St. Luke's in 1978, suspended in 1981. Reason: health-related leave of absence. No record of his return. I searched further. An incident report buried between 2 pages of an insurance document. Handwritten. From the then bishop. Received anonymous letter alleging misconduct at St. Luke's retreat grounds, involving Friar Hastings. Sisters report odd behavior, isolation, unauthorized penance rituals. Unsubstantiated. Dropped. Unsubstantiated. Dropped. I pushed the file away and leaned back in the chair. There was a whisper in my ear that didn't come from sound, just dread. I photocopied the relevant pages and left. Outside, the sky had dimmed. A storm was coming. And I realized I hadn't eaten all day. Back at the rectory, I laid everything out. Diary, photos, church documents. And then the knock came. Soft. 3 raps. Measured. I opened the door. A woman stood there, mid-50s, weathered coat, mud-caked boots. She didn't introduce herself. She just said, "You found them, didn't you?" I nodded. She stepped inside like she'd done it before, sat down at my table, looked at the diary. "My name was Sister Teresa," she said, voice steady but hollow. "I left the order 2 weeks before they vanished. I was the 5th. I didn't speak. I let her continue. I saw it. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know it was him. She pointed to the diary. He made them do things that weren't prayers, things he called cleansing. I asked why she hadn't come forward. She laughed, bitter and cracked. Who would believe me? A runaway nun? Besides, he knew how to cover it up. said no one outside the cloth would understand divine penance. I asked if she thought he killed them. She shook her head. No, not killed, offered. The word hung in the room like smoke. Offered. To what? I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. Not yet.
She slept in the guest room that night, Sister Teresa. Or tried to. I heard her pacing sometime around 3 a.m., her steps soft and irregular, like someone lost in a loop. When I asked her if she needed anything, she only said, "Don't open the cellar." There is no cellar in the rectory, at least not one I'd ever seen. But the way she said it chilled me, as though she was referring to something beneath, not just the building, but the faith, the past, the truth. By morning, she was gone. Her coat was missing from the hook, boots no longer by the door, no note. Just the smell of lavender and damp wood where she'd lain, and her rosary, left carefully across the kitchen table, beads polished smooth from decades of use. I sat for a long time, staring at it. I should have called someone, police, bishop, anyone, but I didn't. Instead, I returned to the chapel. I stood at the pulpit, not to preach, but to listen. That's when I heard it again, a faint thump beneath the altar, as if someone had dropped a book on stone, or a body. The trapdoor was wedged shut, but not locked. I pulled until it creaked open. Darkness greeted me, dense and humid. There were steps, stone-carved, narrow. I descended slowly, flashlight in hand, though the batteries flickered. Each step forward felt like memory unraveling in reverse. At the bottom was a chamber. I hadn't known it existed. No blueprints showed this. The room was circular, stone walls covered in ash markings, symbols I didn't recognize. And in the center, 4 shallow indentations in the ground, spaced like graves, or placements. Above each, a cross, wooden, burned around the edges. No bones, no remnants, just dust. But in the far corner of the chamber, tucked under what looked like a collapsed brick archway, was something newer, a satchel. Inside, photographs, Polaroids, dozens of them, faded and curled from time. All of the sisters, sitting, kneeling, walking between trees, smiling. But the last one, dated July 3rd, 1980, showed all 4 of them around a fire, their eyes open but unfocused. Behind them, in the shadows, was a man in clerical black, face obscured by blur or deliberate damage. Only one thing was legible on the back: final offering before the hour turns. I staggered back. In the corner of the room, a draft whispered through unseen cracks, like someone breathing. I turned off the flashlight, listened. I could hear the chapel above, creaking, moaning, under the weight of something ancient. The trees beyond swayed in unison, like arms in prayer or surrender. I climbed out, sealed the trapdoor behind me. I didn't tell the diocese. I didn't call the police. Some things aren't meant to be catalogued. I burned the photographs, all but one, the one with the fire. It sits on my desk now, beside Sister Teresa's rosary. Every night since, I've felt someone standing behind me as I write, never touching, never speaking, but watching, waiting. And the cellar, the one I didn't know existed, is no longer silent. I don't think I slept for more than an hour that night. The photograph haunted me, not just the image, but the implication. There had always been rumors about the chapel's past, whispered among the elderly in the village, but no one ever spoke clearly. That place was built over silence, one old man had once told me. I'd laughed. Now I wasn't so sure. By dawn, the birds outside sang their soft, brittle melodies. I brewed a cup of coffee with shaking hands. It tasted like burnt ash. I decided to visit the last living person who might know more, Geraldine Marsh. She had been just a teenager in 1980, and her sister Abigail was one of the missing nuns. Her house was 10 minutes outside the village, remote, the kind of place where time hangs heavier. She opened the door slowly, blinking hard through thick glasses. "You look just like your father," she said. I had never met her before. We sat in silence for a long while. She didn't offer tea. I didn't ask. "You've been down there, haven't you?" she finally said, staring at the rings on her fingers. "In the ground, beneath the pulpit." I nodded. "They called it the root cellar," she whispered. "But it's older than the church, older than the village even. It's not just a place, it's a hunger." She opened an old tin box and pulled out a scrap of cloth, faded, torn. I recognized the embroidery, Sister Abigail's name stitched in white thread. "They never meant to leave," Geraldine said, eyes glassy. "They were taken, bit by bit, one dream at a time." I asked her what she meant, and she told me something I've never forgotten. "Faith doesn't always grow toward light. Sometimes it grows downward, into the dark, and when it blooms, it takes everything with it." She handed me a folded piece of paper. "This was left in my mailbox the morning they disappeared. I never showed anyone." The handwriting was small, precise. July 2nd. "They asked us to fast, said the veil would thin tonight, that we'd finally see. But I don't want to see anymore. I want to go home." There was no signature. I left Geraldine's home with more weight than I entered. When I returned to the chapel, everything felt off, warmer, damp, as if something had begun to wake. I went back to the trapdoor and placed the last photograph on top of it. Then I placed the rosary next to it. I whispered a prayer, not to God, but to whoever or whatever might still be listening beneath the stone. That night, I heard scratching, not from the walls, from beneath the floor. It sounded like something old trying to remember how to climb. I slept with the lights on, Bible open on my chest. By morning, the photograph was gone. But something else was left in its place. A slip of yellowed paper. On it, in trembling ink, "They are not gone. They are becoming." I stared at the note for a long time before touching it. "They are not gone. They are becoming." I whispered the words out loud, but they tasted wrong in my mouth. Foreign, like trying to pronounce a name never meant for human tongues. I locked the chapel behind me, even though I knew locks were meaningless now. Whatever had left that note hadn't come through any door. The village was still asleep when I walked the narrow dirt road back to the rectory. Or maybe it was pretending to sleep. Curtains twitched, shadows shifted behind fogged windows. People knew. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to keep them quiet all these years. Back inside, I laid everything I had on the table. The photographs, the rosary, the journal page, and now this latest message. I noticed something I hadn't before. The dates. They all centered around the same day, July 2nd. The nuns had vanished on July 2nd, 1980. The journal entry mentioned fasting on July 2nd. And the old, weathered paper in my hand, it was dated July 2nd as well. The day the veil thins. I began digging into church records, dusty ledgers that hadn't been opened in decades, marriage certificates, baptism logs, funeral notes. And there, buried between the yellowing pages, I found a small, handwritten margin note from 1979. It read, "Midnight service suspended indefinitely. Father Emmett warned not to open the lower vault. July 2 approaching. Keep them upstairs. If they hear it again, it may not let go. Father Emmett, my predecessor, the one whose name had been etched in fading gold on the chapel wall. He vanished 6 months after the nuns did. His body was never found. I sat back in the creaking wooden chair, pulse hammering through my neck. None of this was coincidence. The trapdoor, the dreams, the missing, the unearthed rosary, the picture that changed when no one was watching. And then I remembered something Geraldine had told me. They were taken, bit by bit. It wasn't a sudden disappearance. It was a process, a corrosion of self, like being hollowed out one day at a time until you didn't know what you were anymore, until something else filled the space where your soul used to be. I stepped outside for air. The clouds hung lower than usual, heavy, like they carried a secret. A breeze stirred the trees, and I heard it again, that hum, like a chant beneath the wind, low, rhythmic, ancient. I turned and saw it, carved into the old sycamore across the path, a symbol, deep and crude, a circle broken by 3 lines. I'd seen it once before, on the chapel basement wall, just once, in a flash of candlelight, but it had stayed etched in my memory. Something had marked the tree. Recently, the ground beneath it was disturbed, loose soil, like something had been buried or dug up. I grabbed a flashlight and started toward it, ignoring the screaming pulse in my temples. I dug with my hands at first, then used the old iron spade leaning beside the rectory steps. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I hit something solid. Not a box, not bone, wood, a door, half buried, with rusted hinges and a rusted latch. I cleared the rest of the soil. The door was narrow, old, not part of the chapel, older than that. I hesitated. Then I opened it. The smell hit me first. Earth, yes, but beneath it rot. Something preserved not with intention, but with malevolence. A narrow staircase spiraled downward into darkness, and on the first step, lying flat and clean as if it had just been placed there, a Bible, open to Exodus 20. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. I stood at the edge of the staircase, light trembling in my hand, the beam of the flashlight barely cutting through the dark throat below. The smell was thicker now, wet stone, rusted iron, something older than either. The kind of scent that doesn't just coat your skin, but sinks into your lungs. I stepped down. The Bible on the stair was dry, untouched by time or water. The page edges hadn't curled, no mildew, no ink bleeding. I ran my finger across the passage again. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And still, something in me whispered, but someone did. The descent took time. My flashlight flickered once, then again, and when it did, the shadows on the wall twitched with it, like they didn't belong to me. At the base of the steps, the chamber opened wide, a natural cavern, or maybe man-made, cut stone, uneven and damp. The walls were etched with more of those markings, circles fractured by slashes, spirals breaking outward. It felt like a mouth, the way it curved inward and echoed even my smallest breath. There were things down here. Old wooden benches, a rusted stand for candles, crushed glass underfoot, the remains of what once looked like robes, now reduced to moth-eaten black threads curled in the corners. 1, 2, 4 in total. I found the nuns. Not their bodies, but their presence. Their memory trapped in this space like dust in a sealed jar. I turned, slowly, and that's when I saw the mural. It stretched the entire back wall. A painting, but not with brush or paint, scratched in with iron, finger bone, something jagged, and it showed them. 4 women in habit surrounding a 5th figure, tall, faceless, hands too long, arms curved in prayer or threat, I couldn't tell. Their eyes were scratched out, all 5, with force so deep it had torn the stone behind. The longer I looked at the figure, the more it seemed to move. Not in reality, just at the edge of understanding. Like it was pressing against my mind, reshaping the edges of what I believed could be true. And then came the sound. A slow dragging. Not boots, not footsteps. Flesh. Dragging. Something was down here with me. I spun, light casting wild shadows. Nothing there, but the dragging didn't stop. It circled me, then vanished again. I backed toward the stairs, heart hammering. That's when I saw the altar. A stone slab, split clean in the center. Runes, yes, that's the word for them now, were carved into its base. I don't know how I understood them. Maybe I didn't. Maybe something gave me the understanding. The translation burned into my mind like heat through iron. Offerings do not die. They are kept. They are changed. And on that altar was a necklace, simple, rusted, still glinting with a single copper bead, the kind Sister Margaret used to wear. The dragging began again, closer this time. My flashlight dimmed to a dying heartbeat. Then a whisper. It came from the altar, or behind it, or through it. I'll never forget the voice. He made us stay. We sang. We prayed. We bled. I ran. Up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, scraping my shins, cutting my hands. I slammed the door shut behind me and shoved the spade through the latch to hold it closed. Then I heard it. The dragging. Now on the stairs. I stepped back, 1 pace, then 2, and then silence. Nothing. Only the wind in the sycamore and the heavy beat of my pulse trying to climb out of my throat. But the silence wasn't empty. It was watching me. And somewhere inside that watching stillness was the knowledge that this wasn't over. This was just the crack in the door. The thing that waited below hadn't left. It was waiting for the next prayer. Or maybe the next priest.
I didn't sleep that night. The church stayed dark, its corners hung with a silence so thick I could hear the wood shift in its beams and the wind whimper beneath the eaves. Every few minutes I looked at the trapdoor again, waiting for something to knock, to call, to return. But nothing came, not until morning. When the sun rose pale over the eastern hills, I opened the chapel doors wide and let the light in, just to be sure the night had really ended. The birds were chirping, the frost on the grass already lifting in steam. Ordinary things had returned to the world, but I had not. I called the diocese office. Not to report anything, not yet. I didn't even know what I'd report. I simply told them I wasn't feeling well, that I'd be taking a few days to rest. The voice on the other end offered prayers. I accepted them, though I suspected they wouldn't be enough. That afternoon, I went to the village archive. It's a small building, half museum, half storage. There's a woman there, Martha. She's been running the place since her husband died, and if you ever needed to know which corner of the county a photo came from, or why someone built a barn crooked, Martha would tell you without hesitation. I asked her if she remembered anything strange about 1980. She paused, then nodded slowly. "You mean the sisters?" she said. I nodded. She led me to a locked cabinet at the back of the room, fumbled for a key, and pulled out a dusty box labeled Covenant Hill Parish, 1978-1981. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, even a few cassette tapes from church services. One clipping in particular was folded 4 times and stained along the creases. I opened it gently. The headline read, "4 nuns vanish from isolated parish. Investigation stalled." The article mentioned their names: Sister Margaret, Sister Evangeline, Sister Therese, Sister Joanna. It confirmed what I knew.
Disappeared on a quiet Wednesday morning. No signs of struggle. Police found no bodies. No signs of forced entry. The doors were locked from the inside. But in the last paragraph, something new appeared. A quote from the local sheriff at the time. "There's something odd about this one. The church basement's older than the rest of the building. Never on the plans. Pastor said it's been locked since before he arrived. Said the previous one, Reverend Holloway, never used it either." Reverend Holloway. I'd never heard the name. I searched for it. Nothing online, nothing in the diocesan records. It was like he never existed. But someone had built that room. Someone had drawn those runes, carved that mural. And someone had closed it off, sealed it beneath layers of silence. That night I returned to the church. The altar room was quiet. No dragging sounds, no whispers. But the trapdoor creaked when I leaned against it, as though the air beneath it still pulsed. I stood over it, staring down, then whispered one question. Why them? No answer came, but I felt watched. Then something strange happened. A thought entered my mind, uninvited but crystal clear. Because they asked for more. I didn't sleep again. I sat in the pew nearest the door, the spade beside me, the flashlight clutched in my lap like a rosary. That morning, before dawn, I drove out of town. I didn't pack, didn't call the diocese again, just locked the chapel, left the key under the flower pot where Martha could find it, and drove. Miles later, I stopped on the side of a dirt road, heart still heavy in my chest. I had to understand more. This couldn't be just mine to carry. So I wrote to a former theology professor of mine, someone who specialized in early church sects and fringe beliefs. I didn't tell him everything, not yet, but I described the mural, the figures, the runes. He replied a few days later. His email was short. "What you've described isn't Christian. It's older, possibly pre-Abrahamic. Some sects believed in preservers, beings that sustained order through sacrifice. Some even worshipped them along with angels. But it was condemned as heresy centuries ago. Whatever you found, leave it." I stared at the screen a long time. Preservers. Not protectors. Keepers. Keepers of what? Or of whom? I closed the laptop. Then I heard it again. A sound not from beneath me, but from behind, from inside the room. A voice, faint, echoing like it came from a time through time. It said one word, Father. I didn't move at first. The word hung in the air so softly I could have convinced myself I imagined it. But the cold rush across my skin, the hair standing on my arms, told me otherwise. Father. I turned, slowly. The chapel was empty. But that didn't matter anymore, because something deeper had changed. The church no longer felt like a place of worship. It felt like a gate, a place where something came and went. Something that had been here long before me, maybe even before the village, maybe before the idea of a chapel had even crossed a human mind. And now I was caught in it. The next morning, I drove to the city archives. I requested records for Covenant Hill Parish stretching back as far as they went. The archivist was kind but confused. "That's a pretty obscure place," she said. She wasn't wrong. It took hours, but I found something. One handwritten document from 1891. It mentioned a fire, a building lost. The mission house, it called it. Not a convent, not a church. It said, the fire took 4 sisters. They had been fasting for 13 days. Another fire, another 4. It was the same pattern, the same number. Always women, always hidden, always forgotten. And then, silence. The church had been rebuilt. The records resumed with the construction plans from 1893. But the basement, the one I'd found, wasn't included in any blueprint. It wasn't meant to be there, not by human hands. I returned once more to Covenant Hill. The village was quiet. Fog rolled low across the fields like a blanket pulled tight. I parked at the edge of the cemetery and walked the rest of the way. My boots sank into the wet earth. I carried nothing but a notebook and the old photo of the missing nuns I'd copied from Martha's files. Inside the chapel, I didn't head to the pulpit. I walked straight to the trapdoor. It opened easily this time. The cold air from below met me like an old friend. I climbed down slowly, one rung at a time. The room had changed. There was a candle lit now, and at the far end, seated where the mural had once been, was a figure. He looked like a man, but his eyes were older than any I'd ever seen. They weren't filled with anger or evil, but with understanding, as if I'd finally walked into the right question. I didn't speak. He did. They gave themselves freely, he said, for peace, for protection. You came back. That means it's time again. My voice cracked. Time for what? Another 4. Every generation, 4 lights to hold back the dark. I didn't believe him. I couldn't. But I also couldn't deny the weight in my chest, or the echoes that rang in that chamber like prayers long forgotten. I turned and climbed back out. I locked the trapdoor, and for the first time, I prayed not to be heard. That night, I lit 4 candles. Not for the nuns, not for the village, but for the 4 to come. Because I had seen the truth buried beneath the tree stump. And once you've seen it, it waits for you. The chapel still stands. The wind still moves through the trees around Covenant Hill like it always has, brushing past stained glass and stone as if whispering secrets only the walls can hear. But I don't go back anymore. I can't, because some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some answers, once uncovered, can't unlearned. Every now and then, I hear about a girl from a nearby parish going missing, a visitor who never came home, a letter that never reached its sender. I used to investigate. I used to keep files. Not anymore. Because now I understand. There's a pattern buried beneath history, a rhythm older than stories. And when I stood in that basement, face to face with something that wasn't quite human and yet knew more about sacrifice than any priest ever could, I realized this truth. Some villages survive not by grace, but by trade. We offered them. We always had. And we called it mystery, called it unsolved, called it faith. But deep down, the stone knew, the tree roots knew. And I know now too. Still, every so often, I light 4 candles. Not for tradition, not for memory, but for warning. Because behind every story of vanished women, of burned convents, of trapdoors and silent prayers, there's always something watching, waiting. And in the end, it's not the silence that haunts me most. It's the fact that one night I might return. Not by choice, not by fear, but because something deep beneath the ground will call me back. And this time, I might not come back out.